For a little bit more background information on our work here at Sahiyo, Sahiyo is a transnational organization with branches in the US and India, and our mission is to work with Asian and other communities to empower communities to abandon the practice of female genital cutting. Female genital cutting, or FGC or FGM, is a form of gender-based violence that involves the removal of the external genitalia for non-medical reasons and is often performed during birth to puberty. Some of the programs we offer include a digital storytelling workshop known as the Voices to End FGMC project, which offers survivors and advocates the space and materials to share their story in a 2 to 3 minute digital video they create. We're so honored to have the opportunity to watch a sneak peek of 2 of these videos from our latest cohort today, which are not yet publicly available. So if we can go to the next slide. We are so honored today to also be joined by Dr. Arefa to help moderate our event. Dr. Arefa Kasaboy is an internal medicine physician and chief medical editor of Everyday Health. She is passionate about health equity and health literacy, focusing on projects that raise awareness and empower individuals and communities to improve their wellness through collaborations, including advocacy, research, and education. She is also the chair of the Sahiyo US Advisory Board. Dr. Arefa, please feel free to introduce yourself to the audience as well.
Thank you, Kate, for the introduction. I am honored to be here today for this very important conversation. Sahiyo has brought together an incredible group of panelists. So Kate, I'll let you keep going to introduce them.
Thank you so much. Yep, and next up, I'm so honored to introduce our first panelist, Ume Kulsum Arif. Ume is a lawyer, activist, and sometimes writer currently practicing civil litigation in St. Louis, Missouri. They joined Sahiyo while in law school and have been a part of our community ever since while navigating what it means to be a non-binary survivor of FGM and balance activism with personal safety. Thank you so much for joining us today, Ume, and if you would like to say a few words as well, feel free.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be able to speak here with such august panelists, and I'll let you continue.
Thank you so much. So next up, we are joined today by Dr. Marcy Bowers. Dr. Marcy is a pelvic and gynecologic surgeon with more than 32 years experience. She has now performed more than 2,250 primary vaginoplasties and 3,900 gender-affirming surgeries overall. Dr. Marcy is the WPATH president-elect and currently serves on the Trevor Project Board of Directors, having served previous terms with GLAAD and the Transgender Law Center. Dr. Marcy also works with ClitterAid to offer genital reconstructive surgeries to survivors of FGMC. Please feel free to introduce yourself as well, Dr. Marcy.
Hi, everyone. I'm glad to be with you this early morning. I'm so impressed. We have people from all over the world, I noticed in the chat group, and I hope that we can all share some enlightenment. And I always learn from these panels, and I hope you do as well.
Thank you so much. Next up, our next speaker is Dena Igusti. Dena is a queer, non-binary Indonesian Muslim poet, playwright, filmmaker, producer, and FGC survivor and activist raised in Queens, New York. They are the author of Cut Woman and I Need This Not to Swallow Me Alive. They are the founder of Dearest Mirest, and their work has been featured in Boat Press, Peregrine Journal, and several other publications. And they also participated in Sahiyo's 2022 Voices to End FGMC workshop, and you'll get to see an early preview of their video later in this presentation today. So thank you so much for joining us, Dena. Please feel free to introduce yourself to the audience as well.
Hi, everyone. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. It is super exciting to be a part of this panel, and it's super exciting to see all these folks that are here to hear us talk more about this topic. So yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. And last but not least, we are so excited to be joined today by Afika. They are a Malay Muslim gender nonconforming survivor of FGC living in Singapore. They volunteer with End FGC Singapore, a community-led campaign aiming to empower Muslim communities in Singapore to make FGC obsolete through community re-education and community-based support. They also participated in Sahiyo's 2022 Voices to End FGMC workshop as well, and you'll have the opportunity to watch their video soon. Afika, if you would like to introduce yourself, please feel free.
Hi everyone, I'm super excited, really honored to be here. I do want to preface that this is my first time being on a panel about FGC, so I ask for your patience, especially when the wheels are not turning in my head because it's really late, so it may take a while.
Yeah, and thank you so much for joining us. I know it's late your time, so we really appreciate it. Yeah, next we wanted to move on to watch some of the videos from our 2022 Voices to End FGMC cohort. We wanted to start first with Dena's video titled On Being a Non-Binary Survivor of FGMC, which they created earlier this year. And while watching this video, we really encourage you all to reflect and respond in the group chat. So if we can go ahead and play that video.
As of 2020, estimates are that at least 200 million women and girls have experienced female genital mutilation. This statistic makes me question if I, a trans non-binary survivor of FGM, am real. From language to resources, all aspects of FGM, the before, during, and after, assume an FGM survivor has and always will be a cis woman. I came out as non-binary around the same time I talked openly about my experiences as an FGM survivor through my poetry. At one reading, a woman snapped her fingers and hummed at me when I introduced myself as trans non-binary. She later cried over my shoulder, calling me a powerful woman. At another event, I shared with the organizers that I didn't know if I fit into the gender statistic they plan to open with because I am trans non-binary. They introduced me to a crowded room as one of 200 million girls. I know that when I hear the pronouns she or her, it's my cue to act like a woman. She is asked about future birthing complications as a mother. She is attached to the same statistic that denies me of my personhood. At one point in my life, I convinced myself that she, her was a reclamation of the girl who died on the metal table when I was cut. An assurance that she survived along with me. But the truth is, sometimes she can feel like a white flag, an exasperated sigh after a person calls me a strong lady, an uncomfortable silence when my friends call me a girl when naming what happened to me. I constantly remind myself that out of all the people who attempt to call me things I'm not, I'm the only one who knows what happened to me. I was in that room. I was the one left with the blood that spilled. I was the one who saw a life that would be more than this pain.
Thank you so much, Dena, for sharing that powerful story. And just as a reminder to everyone, we know these videos can be very emotional. We do encourage people to take a step back from their computer if they need to. We can go on to our next video today. Thank you so much. So next up, we'll be watching Afika's video, Conversations with My Mother. Again, these videos have not yet been released, so you will only be able to see them on our YouTube channel in a few months.
When I was 10, my mom and I spent a lot of time watching Malay TV shows. I remember scenes where women had to be ready to serve her husband's dinner as soon as he came home, or where she was criticized for not completing all her chores. As we watched, I asked my mother, why are women treated like that? She had a way of justifying it. Although her words in her face expressed acceptance in her explanations, I wondered why she always looked away from me. One day, I learned a cousin had gotten circumcised. I asked, wait, do girls get circumcised? My mom said, yeah, you were too. All girls and women in our family are. I learned boys get it done young, and there's almost always a feast. It's very festive and supportive. I wondered why my circumcision was kept hidden. Then I asked my mom, why did I get circumcised? She said, so you will not be a wild girl. She meant promiscuous, out of control. I caught her reassuring look, but again, she looked away from me. I more or less forgot about it until I was 18. I was at the sex education workshop and they touched on FGMC in Singapore. And I remembered, oh, this is a thing.
My stomach was queasy. I couldn't accept it. A few weeks later, I was in my mom's room. Malay dramas were on the TV again. I tried to put on a neutral face and asked, "Mama, why are girls circumcised?" Her response was like deja vu. My heart was racing and my palms were damp as I listened. I nodded in understanding, but my reality of gender and sexuality didn't match her expectations. I told myself, my mother thinks it's normal and our culture validates that. But maybe the culture is wrong. As I left the room and shut the door, I kept thinking back to her look of reassurance, the one that manages her anxieties of raising a Malay Muslim daughter.
Thank you so much, Afika, for sharing your video and your voice with us. Now, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Arafa to help lead the panelist Q&A.
Thanks, Kate. These videos were powerful. Thank you, Dana and Afika, for sharing them with us. To start off, I'd like to ask you about the videos. Share with us a little bit about what inspired you to tell the story that you did for the Voices to End FGMC project. Dana, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, one of the main reasons that I wanted to share my story was because I think for me as a survivor, I think there's already a limitation as to how survivors can access resources, because often, at least in my personal stance, when trying to find resources for myself, when trying to find therapy for myself, et cetera, it was already very limited. And it was often, when you Google it, it's bombarded with results that are often very xenophobic. So already kind of rummaging through that, but then later on finding the limited sources that were publicly available, only to find out that they were only for cis women and girls. And there weren't any particular resources for trans non-binary folks or trans men. So as somebody who kind of had to start my healing in that way and kind of assume myself as a cis woman in order for me to access care, I thought it was very important for me to share my story in that regard.
Oh, I'm glad you did. Afika, what about you? And before you start, I wanted to ask, if you're not speaking, if you could put your audio on mute. I think we're getting a little background noise. Sorry, go ahead, Afika.
I think what inspired me to tell my story through the Voices program was the courage that the other survivors had demonstrated when they were telling their very stories about this. So like my friend, who's also a teammate in the game, was in this batch of the program. So at first I was really skeptical of the medium, but when she acted as a proxy, she had a lot of glowing things to say about the program, so I trusted her testimonial. Previously, I had submitted like an audio story to an audio installation project called 1000 Voices. I was in my early 20s. So that story explored how like FGC has possibly impacted my sexuality and my self-image growing up. I think that took me like 2 years to make sense of my experience, but being involved with the campaign, I realized that like most of the time with like advocacy work, with campaign work, there's a lot of externalizing, and the work is like mostly educational. So now that I'm in my mid-20s, I just wanted to take the opportunity to pause, check in myself, and understand like how my story has evolved over the years, and also to contribute to like, you know, saturating the anti-FGC spaces with stories from non-binary survivors, because it deserves the representation. I cannot separate my queerness and my transness, my non-binary experience from my survivorship. So basically, in short, like the inspiration was the audacity displayed by everyone else. Yeah, because I just want a piece of the action.
Thank you. Anybody else? Marcy, Dr. Marcy, Umi, anybody want to make comments? And I want to let everyone in the audience know if you have any questions or comments, please add them to the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to them through the conversation.
I guess I have one comment, because I've been a part of this community for I'm talking about the FGM survivor community for 15 years now, and having been to Africa 4 times and done restoration surgeries there, but also having worked with survivors here in the US. But the intersection with a non-binary identity is just so incredible to me. And I guess I was wondering to Dina and Apika, if in some way and this, pardon me if this sounds inappropriate, but do you think that the surviving FGM, do you think it gave you more strength in a way to assume, to identify, to accept and adopt your non-binary identity? I don't know if is that a bad question?
No,
No,
it's
it's not a
not.
bad
I'll-
question.
Sometimes trauma can be very, it can be very inspirational. And like, for example, I was a bullying victim, and I don't know that I could have made it to medical school if I hadn't found the strength to overcome bullying as a teenager.
I can talk a little more. Yeah, I think for me in a particular way, it did help in that, like, I think while by no means was it the main factor for me to affirm my non-binariness, and like by no means was that by any non-binary was a way for me from running away from that trauma, which is, I know, Dr. Mercy, that's not what you're saying by any means. But I think because and I can speak more about it later, but I think because I was put in a position where cis womanhood was associated with a type of physical violence, and also at the same time, masculinity and like concepts of aspiring to cis men, aspirations of masculinity, were also for me met with a certain type of violence as well. While again, the violence did not affirm me to be non-binary, if anything, I think it gave me all the more reason, and yeah, it gave me all the more reason for me to understand my perception of gender and my perception of non-binariness, in the sense that while it wasn't just limited by who and what has harmed me and what communities and societal expectations have harmed me, at the same time, I'm also thinking as I'm talking, so forgive me if I'm like delayed in my responses. But at the same time, I think I was more aware and more critical of concepts of gender and societal expectations, because a lot of these things that were happening were just associated as a result to binary gender, and I didn't fit in regards to any of it.
Thank you. Afika, what about you? Did you have a comment? And it's okay if you don't.
That's actually a really great question, because I don't think I've thought of that. I feel like if I wasn't a survivor, I would have just went about my life as per usual. I wouldn't think much of it. I think it's only because of like these experiences that like it would force you to think like, how it affects you, because yeah, because like for me, I think like queerness, like, it's just a lived experience. It's not an intellectual one, but like because of like the discourse and everyone having a problem with like my body and like how they should control it, like yeah, that I think that definitely forced me to like think about things and like have a stance. I don't know if I answered your question though.
No, that sounds good. And only I saw you nodding your head. If you have share with us what you were thinking, and also tell us a little bit about your work and how it connects to the themes of this webinar.
Sure. So I had a lot of discussions with myself as a non-binary and asexual survivor, because I often say that I am what I call ace by trauma, because FGC defined the way I view my sexuality and the way I view my ability to express that sexuality. And so I remember when I first came out as ace, I didn't know that I had been cut. But my mother told me, no, you're not actually asexual, you're actually cut. Like this is the way it's supposed to be. And so that part of my identity led me to really consider, am I a whole person? Was a lot of the argument that I had as a young survivor, was, do I get to reclaim womanhood because of survivorship? And had a lot of conversations with myself about whether my non-binariness or my asexuality is quote unquote valid in a way, or am I just this broken thing that has to fit into a box? And so part of that leads into my work. I'm kind of new to the activism world. I'm still trying to find the space where it can be both safe to be an activist and also an act of survivorship, because I'm in a really conservative area where I live, so I can't make that my career, but I have to speak, because otherwise, it's just going to end up consuming me. So a lot of the discussions that we've had are very valid, and that's basically why I was nodding along.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And Dana, could you share with us some of the work you're doing?
Yeah, so for the most part on my end, I am a writer. I mainly am a poet and playwright, but a lot of my work surrounds FGC and being a non-binary survivor of FGC. In addition to that, I usually collaborate with Sahiyo alongside other nonprofits and organizations to talk more and speak more about LGBTQ representation in FGC survivorship.
Okay, great. And Afika, please tell us what you're doing in your corner of the world.
So I think my end was, okay, I'm gonna come in and support FGC survivors of all genders, because of my prior experience of a peer-led support group. But I think with the work, you just wear so many hats, and there's just so many things going on. So I think right now it's just looking into myself first, because okay, there's a lot of educational work, but sometimes you have to stop and just pause and see how the work has impacted you, because there has been it's been traumatizing, not gonna lie.
Okay.
But yeah, having yeah.
Well, tell me a little bit more, tell us a little bit more about what it's been like navigating your sexual and gender identity as a survivor of female genital cutting. I know we've touched on it, but like to hear a little bit more for the audience.
I can go first.
Sure.
I think definitely not easy. There aren't many resources for trans survivors of FGC, as Dana has has talked about. The non-binary trans experience is definitely not a one size fits all. There's no one single look to being non-binary. So for example, because I'm also a fat person existing in a fat body, how people perceive me, as a cis woman, or expect me to be is magnified. But yeah, not all non-binary people are thin or look androgynous by whatever standards. But I think I first learned that my Malay Muslim community practiced FGC when I was 18 years old at that sex ed workshop for female participants. I knew it was mainly for cis-het women, but I didn't care. At first I thought the Muslim feminists were just ruffling feathers for no reason. Okay, or rather for me, I think acknowledging it would open up a can of worms, right? Because the community that I'm a part of is a marginalized minority ethnic religious group in Singapore. And so that means like we'll be dealing with like even more Islamophobia and racism when like the issue of FGC gets into the national discourse. Because it was already stressful to deal with it in school. I think at 18 or 19, I was already going to therapy to like process the racism, Islamophobia, the queerphobia, because it was so traumatizing. So initially, like I think my experience accessing therapy wasn't that great because like the previous therapist was like biphobic. She implied that my cut wasn't as bad as it seemed because I have no recollection of it. But like we know that, you know, like based on trauma research, like that the body remembers. I didn't appreciate the invalidation. So when I switched to a queer affirming therapist, I think I consider myself like lucky now to you know have access to this, like especially when I was like a financially struggling student. But like coming to terms with my queerness and like learning of my survivorship at a later age, I think it made me feel like the late bloomer, like compared to my cis straight counterparts. Because yeah, at first I didn't think much of it because like being queer it's like an embodied thing. It's not something intellectual. I didn't think I have to justify anything, right? Until like, yeah, people like made it into like a debate. I think it also comforted me to learn that like, for example, like my Buddhist heritage affirmed like queerness and transness because of like, you know, the 5 gender system that they had. And also, you know, that like a lot of pre-colonial and indigenous cultures have always been like affirming of like, you know, transness and queerness, even though they don't share like, you know, the same frameworks or language that we use today, but they get that like, you know, it's an embodied human experience. So I think for like FGC, I would say like the language is another hurdle, like, isn't it? Like it was difficult to find the words to express my survivorship as like as a non-binary queer person. It was definitely like a really lonely process. Yeah, I think recently I also came across like Dana's story when Starlit Uden retweeted their story. It's a very affirming read. But I think in a way, like I wish, you know, it hadn't taken me like, you know, this long to like understand myself or like feel alone for like about 8 years. That's, you know, like a long timeline. So yeah, trans inclusivity, even in queer and feminist spaces, still has like a long way to go.
No, thank you. Can you add that read in the chat? I think that you
The
just
read? Dana's.
yeah.
Okay, sure.
And
Find it.
the rest of you on this panel, please share with us what it's been like navigating your sexual and gender identity as a survivor.
Sure, if it's all right for me to go next.
Sure.
One of the biggest things for me, and I really resonate with it because statements is being an activist and kind of having to shatter yourself into little pieces and say that this little piece of me gets to have gender affirming care. This little piece of me gets to be a survivor of gender-based violence. And often I as an activist, when I was using social media as a way to drum up awareness of FGC, having to say that my non-binariness didn't exist really, or because I was getting attacked by TERFs. Unfortunately, this is a community when it comes to FGC and protection of women, where radical feminists or trans exclusivity is often forcibly accepted because people who are trans exclusive will co-opt survivorship activism in order to push their own agendas. And that means that oftentimes in a lot of vocal activists may have very exclusive opinions, and that makes it an act of safety. You know, is it safe for me to be non-binary? Is it safe for me to ask them to acknowledge my pronouns as they? Is it safe for me to say that I'm a non-binary activist in a public space? Or am I going to lose what little community I have as a survivor? Apologies. Both, as unfortunately, Islam is not very trans friendly. It is not very LGBTQIA friendly. And so I don't have my religious community to fall back on as a support. My friends who are LGBTQIA unfortunately can be a little bit Islamophobic. And that means that I have to make that choice between choosing my religion, between choosing my identity, and placing myself in these boxes. And I use glass as a metaphor often when I talk about it, but I feel like I grind myself into dust under the heel of personal safety until there's just nothing left but sand on this hourglass of who am I. It often can feel like time is running out to figure out who I am. I'm approaching 30 and I still haven't quite figured it out.
Well, thank you for sharing all this today. Yes. Dana, how about you?
Yeah, I've pretty much been in very similar boats as speaking of Umi. Like, I'm also just like, me too. Like, I feel like I just want to make.
Well, that's an important part of this conversation. I'm sure those there are people in the audience feeling that way. Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
No, you're so good. But yeah, absolutely. So for me, when it happened to me, I was around 9 years old. And I think I grew up where it was like very quiet. It was very silent in a lot of ways, but also at the same time, it was weaponized against me. So there were aspects of like after I was cut, there was this notion or there was this saying of being the clitoris growing back. And if it grew back, then they'd have to cut me again in order to preserve me, was a lot of the notions. And usually it was associated with anything that was associated with something being promiscuous. So if I was 11 years old and I wore a spaghetti strap tank top or wearing a skirt that seemed too short, even though I'm 11, that was something that happened. But then also at the same time, I noticed, especially growing up with my brothers and also growing up in the neighborhood with only boys, when I wore clothes that were in the boys section, if I wore hoodies, if I shared shoes with my younger brother, if I wore the same hoodie, the same thing would happen. It's a slight tangent, but I don't know if anyone knows the movie Boys Don't Cry, but that movie focuses on a trans man who was violently murdered, and it was on Lifetime. And my mom, instead of interpreting it as being more trans inclusive, she just tried to deter me from any notion of boyhood. So when I started being more quote unquote tomboyish, she threatened to cut me again. My family threatened to cut me in those ways. So immediately I associated gender or going outside of girlhood with immediate violence. So that was something I had to grow up with. And then also at the same time, because there's this quietness that comes with being a survivor, there is this notion of the community being silent about it, quote unquote. I did not even process that I was a survivor or a victim of it until maybe I was 17. And that was because we read A Cut Woman in my senior year of high school, and someone was violently cut in the book. And that still led to a denial because it still did not feel like my experience. And I think similar to Afika, like I was also told, oh, my cut wasn't that bad, quote unquote, time and time again. It wasn't so violent. Like I turned out fine. So a lot of times as a survivor, I denied myself that way. But then on top of that, because I was denied as a survivor in that way, in some ways, it also still denied my non-binariness. Because it kind of denied the ways in which I've been harmed by gender or being a survivor of gender-based violence. But then also at the same time, there was this weird notion of not being non-binary enough because I was associated with gender-based violence, because the terminology is female, because it's woman, it's cis. So there were moments where even amongst like queer friends and LGBTQ friends where they would either change my pronouns or they would immediately call me a girl when referring to me and that violence. So it was constantly me having to fight to say that, yes, I am non-binary, but also I'm a survivor of gender-based violence. But also like, that's part of the violence of this thing of FGC is that it is only associated with this womanhood before, during, and after the cut. And it was something that I had to navigate. And it was something that I just had to create language for myself in that regard. that, and I think also, again, mentioned it before, but when it comes to access and care, a lot of the times the terminology is only associated with women and girls. So statistically, we don't know where the three of us stand in this. We don't know if we're a part of the 200 million or if we're just misgendered as the 200 million, right? Alongside other things. So I think, yeah, it's just something where I feel like it's this notion of just having to create this language for ourselves and kind of just like being in panels like this or being in like small corners of the internet and be like, yeah, me too. And that's kind of the only documented archive and information we have for ourselves.
No, thank you. That was really well said. Now, our time is flying by, and I want to shift our focus of this conversation, but I want to give those of you on the panel an opportunity to make any more comments related to this personal journey. Okay. All right. So I'm going to shift to the legal piece related to the intersection of the LGBTQ plus community and survivors of FGMC. Recently in the United States, we've seen stories of the anti-FGC bills being co-opted to deny trans and gender nonconforming individuals with their right to health care. In the last year, legislators in Texas and Idaho were looking to use pre-existing bans on FGC to block transgender youth from receiving gender-affirming treatments. Now, by gender-affirming care, we're talking about social interventions, pubertal suppression, hormone therapy, and gender-affirming surgeries for trans and non-binary people. Many consider it a human right to have access to gender-affirming care and to consider it a life-saving and healthcare necessity. For those of you in the US, let's start with that, and then we'll make sure our other areas are covered. Dr. Marcy, since you offer both the gender confirmation and the clitoral restoration services, can you help us to understand from a medical perspective why these bills are wrong? Oh, you're on mute. Thanks.
Hi, and again, thank you so much for bringing this conversation to the forefront, because it obviously, for those of us in that perform gender affirming care, whether it's surgery or hormones, as you said, it's deeply disturbing, the fact that people who have no real, their inclinations are not so much in protecting children, adolescents, and young adults from harm as it is rolling the clock back on any sort of diversity. And emboldened by the shift in the Supreme Court here in the US, and some of the victories they've had in reversing some of the gains in women's rights as far as reproductive health care, they're using that leverage now to go after things. And you know, trans is the easy target, and again, having really no special interest in the well-being of people or understanding the struggles that gender diverse people have in their own lives, in facing discrimination, in getting employment, in dealing with families, avoiding violence, but also accessing healthcare. These kinds of things are really, really disturbing. Fortunately, the states you've mentioned right now, those laws have been deflected, but it's very troubling that bills that were designed to protect young girls from being cut by way of FGC, the idea they're translating that to the notion that, you know, that we're somehow that providers of gender affirming care are somehow hurting or affecting these young persons without cause. And so many of us were accused of things like like recruiting in other words, that it's not patient driven, that we're suddenly recruiting patients to come, as though we're drawing them in like a den of thieves, bringing people across into our web so that we can operate on them. And it's so that it's really very, very unfortunate. The one thing I go back to, though, in any of the, if you're going to be fair globally, this applies. This is where I've come, is to, if you want to take an ethical stance on anything, it is about the right of autonomy, not only in access to care, but also in denying care or not being subject to surgical procedures on youth and children. And if you want to be consistent with that, that is the crux of the moral argument that I think we should take. And so for that reason, not only am I against, of course, FGC, I'm against surgery for intersex children, and also male circumcision, even though there certainly are not anatomical correlates, but the idea being that every individual has a right to consent. And so that doesn't directly address your question, but that's where my thinking has evolved. I don't know exactly how you, well, we have many, there's many great thoughts and individuals working on responses and fighting these bills off, fortunately. But I guess I'll just leave it at that and see if that stimulates any discussion.
No, thank you. That perspective is incredibly valuable with the years of your experience on the clinical side. And Umi, as an attorney, what is your perspective on the legal piece here with this legislation?
Absolutely. So, I mean, as Dr. Bowers has already mentioned, we are seeing a lot of abrogation of the right to privacy, which is where a lot of these reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights come in. Unfortunately, with Roe v. Wade on its way to being repealed by the Supreme Court, it's going to be very, very focused on state by state legislation. And when you look at the general definition of FGM by the World Health Organization, we see that it is about the medical purpose of, the reason FGM is a violation is because it carries no medical purpose, whereas gender affirming care carries a medical purpose. And as Dr. Bowers has mentioned, it is all about the autonomy of and the right to choose. It is the right as a private individual to choose what happens to our bodies. And unfortunately, the way these legislations are going, the current political climate, we are relitigating what we hoped would be well-settled law. We are constitutional lawyers who I've spoken to are concerned about how the Roe v. Wade decision will impact things like Loving versus Virginia and Obergefell. And that also means that trans rights, which were always being litigated after Obergefell and were constantly trying to be pushed forward, are going to be unfortunately rolled back by these individuals. And they'll use any excuse to do it. As Dr. Bowers has mentioned, they don't care about the bodies of young children, whether they are femme presenting or those who have been assigned female at birth. They care about their bigotry and their Islamophobia, and they will use it as a hammer to beat anybody who doesn't fall into their definition of good out of America, unfortunately, or into the sidelines.
Afika, what is the political situation like in Singapore? And what is the legislation similar or different compared to the US?
Not really, because the community that practices FGC is a minority racial religious community. So the state prefers to take like a hands-off approach to the issue by relegating the issue to the state-appointed committee leaders and institutions. So that would be like the Minister of Muslim Affairs, MUIS, so that's the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore. The Ministry of Health would also prefer to take guidance from this issue rather than like World Health Organization guidelines. Yeah, the state's not willing to issue like a legislative ban as well on the practice because they're afraid that it might incur like backlash from the conservative factions of the community. But the Singapore campaign stance is we're not really keen to push for like a ban because like the community that's practicing is already marginalized. Poor brown people, Malays, South Asians are overrepresented in carceral facilities. The Malay community in Singapore is already like economically disenfranchised. So we just don't want like more like, you know, queer trans people to be incarcerated as well. Basically, we just don't want to like encourage like punching down, but like in the Singapore context, like the biggest priority would be like repealing 377A. So it's a British colonial era law that criminalizes homosexual sex between men or like penis owners. So like, it can really affect like any gender because like not all penis owners are cisgender men. But I would say like in Singapore, like a lot of the businesses in tech are also like American, European owned. Tech is political, right? So we may not see like a immediate or direct pattern of legislation here in Singapore, but like the US is still like a world international leader. So like, you know, whatever the US does impacts the world and the economy, and like a lot of the anti-LGBT groups are also influenced by like what America does because like they think that what the American homophobes are doing is working. So like there may be a lot of like copying and imitating even when they don't like fully understand like, you know, the harms and the biases, and that, you know, that they may like further their own oppression, right? Because I remember there was like a study where like researchers consumed exclusively transphobic content on TikTok, and like the algorithm fed like more hateful, violent content. So that there was like a rabbit hole of like racism, homophobia, misogyny, white supremacy that showed that like there's no one single issue. So like everything is interconnected. So yeah, so that's why like the repeal of 377A is crucial in Singapore because we need to remove something that may support other forms of oppression and harm. Because right now it's just dangling over like everyone's head.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we're fast approaching the end of our webinar, and Dena, I saw your message. So if you want to put your comments in the chat, you're welcome to. I can read them to the group until the noise comes down. One of our, I'm going to ask our final question that's in the scheduled part of the Q&A, and then I have some from the audience that I'm hoping we have a minute or two to touch on. But this question I wanted to ask is really bringing all of this together. What can mainstream anti-FGMC advocacy groups do? How can they change to meet the needs of LGBTQ plus survivors better? What give us some takeaways.
I think one of the biggest things that we can do as activists for LGBTQ survivors and trans survivors, especially, is making public statements. Unfortunately, a lot of this is hidden in the shadows. A lot of the FGM survivorship is hidden in the shadows, FGC survivorship, and so when you make a public statement, when you make statements like trans rights or human rights, or statements such as we accept, or not just accept, we encourage LGBT and non-binary survivors to join us. We are a safe space, and to publicly rebuke trans exclusive and non-binary exclusive rhetoric. Social media is really big about this because social media is how we raise awareness. A lot of the times we see trans exclusive rhetoric feminists, again, co-opting anti-FGC survivorship and anti-FGC activism, but for non-trans and non-binary activists to then respond with rebuking that and to say, no, these are our friends. These are our compatriots. These are people who are human. They have the same human rights, and allowing that intersection to be out in the open, thus creating a space for those who are trans and non-binary to exist. It could be as simple as putting your pronouns in your Twitter bio. It's as simple as publicly saying trans rights are human rights on Facebook or Twitter, or allowing and sharing the voices of trans and non-binary individuals who feel comfortable sharing their voices. So that is one of the biggest first steps to make when it comes to giving us a space to feel safe, and then offer our own needs as individual people. Because everybody is different, but we're never going to be able to say what we need as different individuals if we don't feel safe.
I mean, you said that so well. It was really, really powerful. And I thank you for those were actionable steps in terms of what we can do. And hopefully this webinar is a small start, and we can follow with more webinars in this vein. The rest of you, anyone else want to make a comment?
Shelby Quast did suggest that in the chat that we all do our best to support the Equal Rights Amendment in the U.S., which still has not passed. It's 28 states have ratified. It's a long shot, but I think we still need to work for that. It's a 20, 30, 40-year-old initiative, but it is the ideal that we really need to reach for.
No, thank you. That's true. Appreciate that, Shelby and Dr. Marcy. All right, so I do have a question from Anna. I found the videos and the conversation really inspiring and powerful. My question is, I know being misgendered can be really harmful in all kinds of ways. And so I wondered what specific things the panelists think healthcare providers can do better. This is a great question. Thank you, Anna.
I guess I'm the only healthcare provider, so
I can jump into a little bit, but you please, you're the specialist.
Why don't you? No, I mean, I think Umi already indicated some of the things, but inclusivity in your intake forms, wearing a pronoun button on your white lab jacket, educating your office about being respectful of people's pronouns. So if there's uncertainty as to what their gender presentation is, don't be afraid to ask what pronouns they prefer. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. Also, if you're ignorant about something, don't assume, but ask in a way that's open and non-judgmental. Those are all things that I find very, very favorable.
I think from my perspective as a primary care internist, getting the word out about these topics is so important. I've done some work with medical education, and it's really important that clinicians understand that when they are taking care of a patient, that they really meet the patient where they are. So this means that it's not an assumption of anger or shock or disgust or just really all these strong emotions, to really keep a neutral voice, answer the questions that the patient asks, provide the care that the patient is asking for, really take that time to understand, is there an issue that's got a mental health piece? Is there an issue that's a physical health piece? To really, again, meeting the patient where they are in their journey and providing the support services that they need. And that may mean that in the moment they have to stop the clinical exam and admit that they are ignorant of resources and information, and then follow up later. So that's really a huge part of the advocacy education work that I have focused on. People are just not aware. They don't understand the realm of what can exist with female genital mutilation and cutting. They also don't understand the realm that can exist within the trans, non-binary, LGBTQIA plus community. And it's really important to stay humble and listen and admit that, so that then the next step can be to self-educate and provide, the care needed.
Absolutely, Dr. Arafa and Dr. Bowers. One of the biggest things as a patient who absolutely hates going to the OBGYN because of this, it can be very frustrating when I go to see my doctor or when I have a consultation with an initial doctor and see shock or pity or revulsion cross over their face when I say, I am a survivor of gender-based violence, and explain what happened to me. Because I already know it's shocking. I already know it's horrifying. I lived it. I just need you to tell me that I can get care a lot of the times. And so that as a training tool is really important. And so you mentioned keeping a neutral face is very, very important and necessary for patients, especially non-binary patients who are already afraid to be able to even go to the doctor for fear that they may be denied care because their doctor may be more conservative. Unfortunately, a lot of hospitals in my area are associated with religious organizations, so it can be very, very difficult.
And I'll add, Shelby, thank you for making your comment in the chat box. I'll read that to everyone. Increased training for mental health professionals is so important. My daughter is a psychologist that has been specializing in trans patients and other non-conforming identities. There is such a high rate of suicidality, hoping for more focus and partnership with trained mental health providers. Thank you for sharing that. Dana, I know you've been quiet because of the noise. Is there anything you would like to add?
Yeah, I can add a little bit. I think it sounds good on my end. But yeah, from also similar indication perspective, not being that was discussed, but also even when it comes to Google search terms, when it comes to the website itself, language is everything. I think in the health, being in for both mental health care and also physical health care, not assuming that just because a person is found presenting that they are a cis woman, not assuming that people are having sexual and romantic relationships only with men, and asking for partners only for men. And when it comes to healthcare websites, especially for healthcare specifically for FGC survivors, using survivors of gender-based violence instead of women and girls makes all of the difference, both in FGC and also just in other forms of healthcare as well.
Great. Sorry, I missed your comment. So thank you.
No, you're so good. You're so good.
So any other final comments before we wrap up today? I want to thank you all for joining today in this webinar. We'll definitely plan on having follow-up conversations. Again, I want to, Umi, Dana, Afika, thank you for your bravery and courage to come and speak your story, share with us your story. Dr. Marcy, thank you for your many years of service in this area and really appreciate that. And for those of you in the audience, the chat box has been an incredible discussions. I really appreciate all the contributions there. All right, I'm going to hand it back to Kate. But otherwise, we are done with today. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just to echo everything Dr. Arafa said, here at Sahiyo, we're so honored to have had you all in this amazing and engaging panel today. So we really appreciate your time. And for those in the audience, we have our contact information up on the slide, info@sahiyo.org. If you'd like to email us, our website is sahiyo.org, and you can find us on social media at Sahiyo Voices. Following up from this event, we should be able to send out a recording and an evaluation, and we'd really appreciate it if everyone would be able to fill out the evaluation for us, just so we can know how you felt about this event and what other things you would like covered moving forward. But otherwise, that is the end from me, and I'll leave this slide up for a couple of minutes just for people to jot things down or reflect in the group chat. But thank you everyone so much for joining us today for A Quiet Violence, Navigating Female Genital Cutting as an LGBTQ Survivor.